Hi there. Welcome to the Sober Circle channel. Enjoy this speaker tape.
Okay, and our main speaker for tonight is Hanna F. from Laguna Beach. Please welcome her.
Thanks, Suzanne. My name's Hanna, and I'm an alcoholic. Okay. That always seems to be the way it is. Just something really irritates you about something or somebody, and you find yourself doing it. I really hate that. When I was new in Alcoholics Anonymous, I remember that, that thing when they say one finger pointing out, three fingers pointing back, or the thing that really bothers you in somebody, is either because it's something you're doing or you've done. I like to put it in past tense. I never really liked that. We got a lady in our area start talking about disowned selves. Well, that's a whole other venture that maybe we'll get into some other time. But anyway, I'm really glad to be here tonight. And thanks for the invitation and all those of you who showed up. And those of you who tore yourselves out of the casino, and those of you who are just here for a meeting. It's good to be here. Something that Suzanne said about getting things into perspective and realizing why you're here. And I'm just coming back to a lot of those basics for myself. And it's been a long haul, and it's been a good one. And I will get into that. It's surprising that I would find myself at any point in my life, from where I came from, glad to be in a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. First of all, I'm not prone to gratitude. And second of all, I knew better than to be an alcoholic. And the reason I knew better to be an alcoholic is because, like a lot of you, I grew up in an alcoholic home. And I watched things that alcoholics do. And I made my promises. The same promises that those of you who grew up in an alcoholic home make. They were natural to that. That I was never going to drink, that my life was going to be different, and that I was going to make something out of my life. And I guess when I got a little bit older, I figured that when I got old enough, I was going to get the hell out of there, and that I was never going to look back. That I was really going to do something. And, I ended up here. I always like to say, well, so much for good ideas. I don't burn out on them very easy. But anyway, I'm going to tell you a little bit about background. I have these two brothers. I have a brother who's 6 months older, or a year and a half older than I am, and a brother who's 6 years younger than I am. And I always like to tell this story because it describes me in a very short period of time. It's a situation that probably never really happened. But the reason I always like to tell this story is because it feels real. And it describes me real well. So I got this older brother, as I told you, and he's a golden boy. He's the kind of kid that no matter what he does it extremely well. He's really talented in all these areas, and I really hated him for that. And when we were real little, we used to go places with my folks, naturally. We'd go, over to their friend's house, and eventually my folks would get around to introducing the children. And, of course, first they'd introduce Mr. Wonderful. And they'd look over and they'd go, yes, this is our elder son, Hank. He's a star pitcher in the Little League. He's the best student in the class. He's artistic. He's musically inclined. Truthfully, at the age of 7, there was this cello by this piano. My brother went over and just started playing it. He'd always played it. And they would go on and on about this list of terrific attributes, about my brother, what a wonderful guy he was, and how popular, and on and on and on. So my brother would, of course, be over there just beaming, and I'd be on the other side dying, and I'd be thinking, God, what's going to be left for me? And so when they get through with Mr. Wonderful, they'd look over at me, and they'd say, and this is our daughter, Hanna. And there'd be this long period of silence. And they'd look at me, and they'd look at their friends, and they'd look at me, and they'd look back at their friends. And then they'd say, Hanna, she's intense. Wow, I mean, I want her to be bright or something, but the truth of the matter is I've always been the kind of kid and adult, I've never kind of felt nothing. I'm like real happy, or I'm real sad, or I'm really pissed off, or whatever it's been, I've really been there, emotionally, that's some of you here, hanging on the edge. Now, I'm not a person who drank my way into the state of being. I just arrived here like this. And, I was the kind of kid who always laughed at the wrong places and too loud and all that other stuff. And I don't know whether I really did or not. I don't know if that was just my self-obsession, but it always seemed like that. It always seemed like I was inappropriate. That's probably the best way to put it. And I don't know that it has anything to do with alcoholism at all, but I'll tell you what happens to people like us when we get sober is we are coming bouncing off the walls. There was nothing more terrifying to me than to come into a room of Alcoholics Anonymous or in a room with anybody in it and be absolutely clean and sober, because I never knew what was going to happen. God knows what was going to come out of my mouth and how I was going to react. And I guess for a lot of times drugs and alcohol gave me, a sense of being in control. And probably for about 30 minutes. And The whole time I drank and used, you know. And God knows I spent the rest of the time I drank and used hoping for that 30 minutes that I experienced at one time when I really felt in control. Because there's a speaker around Alcoholics Anonymous, his name's Serenity Sam, and he says when he started drinking, he just started at the bottom and laid there. And, and that's the way I drink, you know, and that's the way I drank, you know. Anyway, I grew up in this alcoholic home, and as a direct result of my father's alcoholism, he committed suicide. And according to the circumstances, you know, I assumed that it was my responsibility, it was my fault, it was something that I said, it was an argument we had, and, you know, I decided to focus in on my mother's drinking, and that I was going to be responsible for this drunken mother of mine and my two brothers. And I will tell you that nobody told me that it was my fault or that I was now saddled with the burden of the responsibility of raising this adult and two children, but I just took this on. And what I'm saying is, this is another thing in my sobriety I've had to look back at, where a lot of these ideas started, and that's where I pinpoint it. Because I've had a hell of a hard time keeping my hands off other people the way that I think they ought to do it. And I know a lot of us do. Anyway, I got really obsessed with alcohol at a real young age. I wasn't obsessed with the way I drank it. I was obsessed with the way other people drank it, namely my mother. And I was like an albatross around that woman's neck. You know, it was just a literal pain in the ass. So anyway, as time's progressing and I'm getting a little bit older, those ideas, I think, you know, when I was real young, it was a good idea. It was obviously a good idea. Watching the kind of destructiveness that centered in our home around alcoholism. I mean, it's a good idea that, you know, that I don't drink, that I look at that sort of thing. But it became an obsession for me. It became a mental obsession. And along with not drinking, you see, I was going to be a good girl. And I'm not talking about your average run-of-the-mill good girl. I'm talking about a really good girl. And I didn't exactly know what good girls get to do, but I'll tell you the list is real long about things that they cannot do. And I was really rigid. And that's probably putting it mildly. But anyway, obviously I took my drink or I wouldn't be standing here. I'd be over in the Al-Anon meeting. And that day came when I was in junior high. And I hadn't planned it this way. When I was in junior high, we moved to a new city. It was the city of Camarillo. It's in California where the state hospital is. State hospital comes later in my story. Yeah, it's just one of those, yeah. Anyway, so I moved up to the city, and I went to this new junior high school, and I was ostracized by all these other kids. I mean, I had no friends, and that just added, you know, some self-pity and a lot of other things that are going on during that really neat period of life for some of us. Anyway, I went to this junior high school dance one night, and of course I put all my eggs in this one basket, and I somehow figured I was going to go to this dance and I was going to be discovered that night. My whole life was going to change as a result of this dance, and my life did change, but not in the way that I thought it was. You see, what I had planned was I thought I was going to go to this dance, and they would discover me, and they were the popular kids. And I thought I'm going to go in there, and I'm going to be having a great old time, and they're going to look over, and they're going to realize what a really terrific gal I really am, and how they just somehow overlooked me. And or Prince Charming was going to come and, you know, swoop me up off the dance floor and ride off into the sunset and live happily ever after. I mean, that was reality to me. And you can see I had a few nuts and bolts missing. But anyway, I went to that dance that night. None of those things happened. I ended up being the perpetual wallflower as usual. And, you know, I got to say, emotionally, I arrived in Alcoholics Anonymous in precisely the same way I left the dance that night. You know, with all those emotions. And that just terrific and horrific feeling of incredible loneliness and incredible sense of isolation from other human beings. It was horrible. What happened is I got on home from the dance that night. My mom was really drunk, which was not unusual. But what was unusual is instead of there being some strange man there, or our new father, as my mother used to like to, she collected those like a charm bracelet. And there was a neighbor lady, and my mom and the neighbor lady were really drunk. And they had this great idea that I should go down the street and spend the night at the neighbor lady's house with her daughter. Now, I hesitated for a moment because, you see, her daughter was a bad girl. Her daughter smoked cigarettes, and she drank booze, and she ran around with boys. And I was never going to do any of these disgusting things. Because good girls don't. But good girls do what their mothers tell them to, so I marched on down the street. You wonder why I didn't have any friends? Anyway, I marched on down the street, knocked on the door, and this girl opens up the door, and she's got a big smile on her face like she's glad to see me. Now, that surprised me right off the bat. So she's also got this big, tall glass of Coke in her hand, and she hands it to me. Now, I want to tell you that in that next moment, I wanted that girl to think I was somebody. I wanted her to think that I was one of those popular kids and that I was going to have to dancing all night, having a grand old time. So I took a big old drink out of this Coke, and it was about half full of bourbon. And immediately out the door go any of those ideas about how I was never going to drink and the vows and promises. You know, I didn't stand there and think about all the awful things I'd witnessed and any of those things. The only thing I ever remember consciously thinking about at that time was I was hoping that she wasn't noticed I was choking. You know, it's like gasping for air. But I mean, I was, you know, a person of probably thin values at best. You know, I went from I was never going to drink to I did not want this girl to know it was the first time. You know, I wanted her to think, I guess, I was some sort of a sophisticated drinker, which, you know, at 12 or 13, I don't know how sophisticated you can be. Because she got sober, but so much for sophistication. Anyway, I don't even remember shutting the door that night, but I do remember the morning after, and I came to the following morning in this girl's room. Now, prior to that night, she had what I thought at that time was kind of a typical little girl's room. It was all white. And it had, had these two twin beds with all the ruffles and the frou-frou and all the pretense of purity and virginity. And I always like to say her mom was in a state of denial. It'd been a long time for that girl who had lived like that. Anyway, this room did not resemble anything that it had the night before. This room was a disaster area. Apparently I started smoking during the night too, so there was these overflowing ashtrays. And I mean, that's the way I smoked, just like I drank, you know, a total pig. So there's overflowing ashtrays, there's beer cans strewn all over the room, there's drinks laying around, newspapers crumbled up, and apparently I tried to get out of bed in the middle of the night, and there was a window by my bed, and I'd yank on the curtain to lift myself out of bed, and I'd rip the curtain rod half off the wall. You know, it was just destroyed. So I looked over at my friend who was propped up on the other bed, and I asked her what happened, and she laughed at me. She said, "Sure, what happened?" And now, I'm familiar with blackout drinkers, because that's the way my mom drank. My mom was a violent drinker, and she was a blackout drinker, and I was very familiar with it. And I'm not about to tell you that I was not afraid that morning. Because what happened to me that morning is underneath all that arrogance about what a good little girl I was fear. That's what prompted that arrogance. And you see, my fear was that if I ever drank, that I'd be just like her. And by that time in my life, I had grown to hate my mother. And I didn't want to be anything like her. As a matter of fact, I used to resent it if people even said I looked like my mom, much less that I was ever going to behave like her. And that's the kind of fear that gripped me that morning. But I'll tell you something I've learned since I've gotten sober in Alcoholics Anonymous. And that is, for the real alcoholic, that fear in and of itself is not enough to keep you sober. It might be enough to get some people to seek some help, but it cannot sustain sobriety, not over the long haul, not like you're going to need it in, you know, the day-to-day business of living. And that fear by itself didn't keep me sober very long, because I went out and I drank again that day, and I blacked out again that day, and that is the way I continued to drink until I came into Alcoholics Anonymous. You know, I don't know anything about social drinking at all. Absolutely nothing at all. You know, I grew up in this alcoholic home. You know, I went right into alcoholic drinking, and I got sober in Alcoholics Anonymous when I was 20. And I spent, you know, the rest of the time in Alcoholics Anonymous. I did get into controlled drinking right away, though, and initially my method of control was drugs. And I guess it sounded good to me. And that's what I did, is I found myself in a position in my life where I was choosing about, well, shall I be a drug addict or shall I be an alcoholic? It's kind of funny how life's choices rather narrow down there. In all honesty, I have to wonder why I wasn't choosing between a few other things, like being a librarian and like an airline stewardess or a travel agent or something else. But it looked to me as though my life had gotten to a point where I was choosing, shall you be a drug addict or an alcoholic? And a drug addict looked like a better way to go. And the truth of the matter is I liked booze way too much for my own comfort. I was uncomfortable with how much I liked alcohol. I was not a person who drank for taste. You know, I liked what it did to me, and that made me real uncomfortable. So I started to use drugs, and then I started immediately I picked up my third addiction. My other addiction besides alcohol and drugs was going to jail. I happen to be one of these people who just has a knack for being in the right place at the right time. And it was a pattern that I fell into. And this is something I've noticed since I've been sober in Alcoholics Anonymous and listened to a lot of stories. Often alcoholics, they fall into pattern drinking. And normally people don't choose the pattern they fall into. You just kind of find yourself drinking along this pattern, whatever it is. And my mother, for example, my mother was a pattern drinker. It used to look to me like my mom's favorite thing to do on Saturday night was she would go out and she would drink and she would get drunk and she would get married. And, yes, I knew Dad, you know. What happened to the last one, you know? Or Uncle Charlie, that was a really good one. And the reason I know that's a pattern is because I've heard that story so often in Alcoholics Anonymous that I recognize the pattern. And of course, my pattern was I would drink and get loaded and go to jail. And, you know, we were a fine pair for a lot of years, you know, really a fine pair. I had my first experience in Alcoholics Anonymous when I was 18 years old. I was laying up in the county jail, and I got called into court one day, and I stood before a judge who suspended all my sentence, and he released me to the custody of some man I didn't even know. And this man I didn't know happened to be a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. And what had happened unbeknownst to me behind the scenes is this man had heard a little bit about my background. And even though my life was all muddled up with drugs at that time, this man recognized alcoholism when he heard about it. And he was hoping to help some of the young people get sober in Ventura County in California at that time. And so he went through a great deal of effort to talk to the probation department and the public defender and the district attorney and the judge and anybody involved in the case to get me a chance, to get me a break. Now I want to tell you that day I stood there in front of that judge and he suspended all my sentence. Not 1 ounce of gratitude went through my mind or my body. I was so insulted. I was absolutely insulted. And what I was insulted by was that this judge had the audacity to call me an alcoholic in front of all those other people. And all those other people were the other inmates awaiting sentencing. But, I mean, a girl's got to have her pride where she did it, even if you're scraping. And of course, the absurd thing is I was standing there that day. I was in a county blue uniform. I was in an old ragged sweatshirt, torn up tennis shoes. I was handcuffed behind my back. I had lost every right that a citizen has. And I was not embarrassed or insulted because I stood there in that manner. I was embarrassed and insulted because he called me an alcoholic. And what really bothered me that day is standing in the courtroom, you see, was my mother. And what I really wanted to do is I wanted to spin around and I wanted to point the finger at her. And I wanted to announce to anybody who would listen to me that if they wanted to see a real alcoholic, I wanted to tell them, there's your alcoholic. I wanted to tell them that the reason I was standing there in that courtroom and all that trouble that day was because of her. It's because of what she did to me, the way that she raised me. Or it was because of them. It was because of those lousy laws and rules and regulations that they all had out there. Because I was certainly a person at that time in my life who did not believe that it was anything that I did. I believed that it was the causes and the conditions outside of myself that made me do the things that I did and live the way that I lived. And very simply, I believed it was your fault. And there's no way you can get help for a problem if it's not yours. And that was my attitude. But I'll tell you that day I really didn't say anything in that courtroom. I think my eyes just hit the ground. And I followed the bailiff out of there, and I rolled up my bedroll, and I got my things, and I went with this AA member. And he took me to a little hospital in Oxnard where I was to spend the next month or month and a half. And when I got my things all settled in my room, he called me into his office. And I went into his office, and I sat across the desk from him. And for the next hour and a half or 2 hours, this man gave me his AA pitch. He told me his story. He told me what he used to be like, what happened to him, and it was obvious what he was like today. Now, after all this man had been through and everything he shared for me and had done for me, when he was through telling me his story, I looked across the desk at him and I thought one thing. I thought, this guy's lying. Because I thought nobody could look as good as this guy looked and have been the places he claimed to have been. Except that today I know that for a sober member of Alcoholics Anonymous, that for every one of us that grab a hold of this thing, you're going to have a rags to riches story to tell to somebody. And I'm not talking about what happens in your pocketbook. I mean, that might be part of it. I'm talking about what happens to you on the inside. I'm talking about when you get further down the line, the kind of thing that you don't have to tell people about. They know it when you walk in the room. That's the rags to riches thing that everybody sitting here tonight, if you grab a hold of this thing, that's what you're going to have to tell to somebody. Because it's important to somebody. But back then, I got to tell you, it looked too good to be true. I thought he was just selling me a bag of goods, that it just wasn't that way. And what I did then is I did all the things they tell you not to do when you're new in Alcoholics Anonymous. And basically what that boils down to is I looked for all the differences, and God forbid I should see any similarities. The bottom line is I didn't want to be an alcoholic. And it isn't that I have any deep psychological need to be different from other folks. It's that I didn't want to stop drinking. I mean, that was really it. Now, I had to be sober over 10 years in Alcoholics Anonymous to be honest enough about that. But that was it. They used to go around the table and everybody would introduce themselves. They'd say, I'm Mary and I'm an alcoholic, or I'm Joe and I'm an alcoholic. And they'd come to me and I'd say, yeah, my name's Hanna and I'm a heroin addict. And, and I am at least 10 years younger than you people. And what I did is I looked at Alcoholics Anonymous at that time as though it was some sort of educational program, and I was there to learn my lesson. And so when my retired time was up there, I left there with that attitude that thank you very much, now that I know better, I'll do better. And the sad thing about people like me is that we believe it. We go out there with every intention of making something good and decent and worthwhile out of our lives. I had the same ideals come back to me that I did when I was a little girl. I was going to go back to school and I was going to make something out of my life. And I was going to, learn that very hard and painful lesson. But it wasn't to be that way for me. With all the good intentions in the world, I didn't stay sober more than 2 weeks, I'm sure. I probably got drunk the day I got out of there, and I got right back into the drugs. And what happened to me in my own case is that everything I had not done up to that point, I proceeded to go out and do. And I never intended it to be this way. But what happened to me is I became a regular on those emergency wards in those emergency hospitals as a drug overdose and as a suicide attempt. I made the jails again on a regular basis. I finally made that patient at lockup in Camarillo State Hospital, and later I was made a ward of the county mental health. And for me, at the very end, I found myself standing out in the street corner in Oxnard one day, having just prostituted myself. Now I want to tell you that I have died 1,000 times over, and in 1,000 disgusting ways. And you know what happened to me the whole time I was out there is I never knew any of this had anything to do with alcoholism. The honest to God truth is my life was going downhill so fast I hadn't the slightest idea what was going on. I just hadn't the slightest idea. But what was so painful for me that day in Oxnard as I stood out in that street corner is I took a long look at myself. And I was full of disgust. I was full of a lot of things. But I want to tell you that the thing that disgusted me most and the thing that was most painful to me was that I realized that it was not the act of prostitution that bothered me so much. It was that it was so easy. That's the thing that sickened me so, is I realized it had become so easy for me to do that. And the reason it became so easy is because, you see, I sold myself out a long time ago. I sold myself out a long time ago. You know, I look back over my life, and it's all the cheap and petty compromises that I made along the way that allowed me to be in a position where it was no longer a big deal. This is why I think real simply that our program stresses rigorous honesty. Because I think that at some point or another, you know, you'll get in touch with the fact that you go along in your sobriety and you realize that you can no longer get away with the little deals again. Because the penalty is real simple. It's drunkenness. And for me, in my own particular case, I don't think there's any God out there with a big book marking off the marks, you know, and going to let me have it. I think it's something that happens to me on the inside, because that's what happened to me as a result of that experience. As I look back and I realize that I wore away at the core of my very being and my own integrity and self-worth and all those other things that you hear about. I wore away at them a long time ago, and I have had to pay some dear prices in order to get them back. And I know what those words are about today. I know what it's like to live that way today, because I've known what it's like not to live like that, just like you have, to the varying degrees. You know, they say that loneliness is the hallmark of the alcoholic, and I don't care what kind of experiences you've been through. Everybody who walks into Alcoholics Anonymous has known it to the intense degree. Everybody has. What happened to me that day out in Oxnard, I got to tell you, is I didn't have any major revelation. You know, I didn't suddenly remember about Alcoholics Anonymous and run over to a payphone and drop down a dime and, you know, ask for help. You know, I had so much self-hatred going for myself then that I thought it was an ego trip for somebody like me to ask for help. And I think I would have just stayed out there and died for all I cared. But what happened is I was rescued by the police department one last time, my home away from home. The truth of the matter is, at that time, it was the only home I had. But anyway, I found myself back there, locked up in the county jail, and things were real different. Something had happened to me on the inside. And I think in some measure that I had been what they call surrendered. I think it had happened to me. And I've had to do it consciously time and time again in Alcoholics Anonymous, and I know my road will be filled with more of them. But I'll tell you what happened to me during that last arrest. I was driving around in the middle of the night one night, and I was just drunk out of my mind. And I was driving in this old stolen VW. And the story about the stolen Volkswagen is that, you see, I had this old boyfriend, and he broke my heart, so I stole his car. Those are my rules, and when I drink, you play by my rules. And so I battered this thing up real well. You know, I was driving around in the middle of the night and in a lot of pain, and it's kind of a last-ditch effort. I knew this guy in Port Wine Union Naval Station, and I thought I'd go in there and see if he could rescue me or something. And so in order to get onto the naval station, you have to go through a guard booth. And I pulled up to the guard booth, and I was so drunk the guy couldn't understand what I was saying. And so he leaned a little bit closer, and I said, "Help me, God help me." And I believe that was a sincere form of prayers I've ever prayed, because it was answered. And even though I was just utterly drunk out of my mind, the sincerity came from somewhere. You know, your spirit, your soul, something inside of me cried out for that. I do not really remember this. The only reason I know about it is because it's all written in the police report. And that's how I know what happened to me. But I got to tell you, as a direct result of that experience, I'm standing here. And at the end of this month, I'll celebrate 16 years of sobriety. It's been a long road, and it hasn't always been an easy one, but I'm going to tell you compared to what. Compared to what? You know, there's been many, many times in my life I've had to look at an experience. I look back at that experience, and it was a bleak experience. It was one of the bleakest times in my life. I had all kinds of warrants out for my arrest. I was in so much trouble. And truthfully, jail was the only home that I really had. And it looked like the bleakest moment of my life, but it was the springboard that brought me into Alcoholics Anonymous and that truly gave me a chance for a good way of life. And I don't know. Now, I don't always have that gratitude with me when I'm walking through this kind of dark experiences, but tuck it away for you because you're probably going to need it sometime. You never know what kind of a pinch you're going to get in. And sometimes it's those little things are the little lights that get us through those times. Now, I didn't know any of that then. I knew that I was going to jail. I went to jail, did some time, and as a direct result of during that time, part of my sentence was to be sent to this program in North Hollywood called Cry Help. And it was at the program of Cry Help. Oh, yes, that's a good repetition. You guys don't know it, so I can look really decent. But it was at the program of Cry Help that I came back into Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, I didn't even remember I'd been to AA before until I was sober 5 months, because I had this feeling when I came back into AA, I looked around and I go, oh my God, this is it. This is that good life that I was always looking for when I was a kid. And, I looked around at the sober members of the program and I thought, God, these are the good people. And what happened to me is I got intimidated by the sober members of this program because I thought, no, these are the really good people. And if they know where I've been, I'll be kicked out of AA. And, shame does really strange things to some people, and it really blocked my ears up for a long time. I just didn't hear the stories the way that they were being told. I got my first sponsor in Alcoholics Anonymous when I was 30 days sober because they made me. And, as I told you, I got sober and I became that wallflower one more time, and, all that intensity returned. And it was all I could do to speak, and I'm not talking about just raising my hand in the meeting, though I found myself doing that. I found myself on many occasions being so inspired that as terrified as I was of people, I would raise my hand and I would share at a group level. But anyway, I was coming up on my 30 days, and in order to stay in the Cry Help program, you had to have an AA sponsor. And I was court committed, so I started sponsor shopping. And on Sunday nights, they used to have these women's meetings, at that place, and then they would have men's meeting, and they would have women with, varying lengths of sobriety, and you could kind of check them out. And I was real close to my 30 days, and I heard this lady speak, and I really wanted to ask her to be my sponsor. She reminded me of what my mom would be like if my mother ever got sober, and I thought it was really a keen idea. So I was going to go over to her after the meeting, except she was this real popular speaker, and all the other girls were kind of clustered around her, chatting with her, and I just said, I can't hack this. And I went against the wall, and I was feeling real sorry for myself because I was too shy to talk to her. And I looked down the wall, and standing there by herself was another lady who'd spoken, and there wasn't anybody around her at all. So she looked pretty available, so I just slid up next to her, and I asked her if she'd sponsor me. And I had real pure motive. And and she said yes. And we started to talk, as you do when you first meet people in AA, your name, little information, kind of chit-chat back and forth. And then she went and she grabbed a copy of the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, and she tucked it under her arm. And she asked me if I'd follow her around back to the little private office, which I did. So we went into this little office and sat down, and she opened up that book to portion chapter 5. Now, after the A, B's, and C's, it says, that you hear read at meeting, after the A, B's, and C's, it says, being convinced, we were at step 3. And that's when she started to read to me out of the book. And she read to me all the way up to where there's this prayer, when you're going to take your 3rd step, there's a prayer that they suggest that you take with somebody else. And where the prayer is, she handed me the book, and she asked me to read that prayer out loud over and over again until I felt it. And I was afraid. And what I was afraid of is I was afraid she was going to make fun of me, because I felt so vulnerable right then. But you know what? As afraid as I was, I sat down and I read that prayer and I said it over and over again. And there weren't any thunderbolts or anything like that. The point is I just did what this lady asked me to do. And at the conclusion of that evening, she spoke to me about writing my 4th step. And I'm so grateful for the way I was given Alcoholics Anonymous. I am so grateful that that lady that night did not tell me that I should wait until I felt stable enough to take the step, because we'd probably still be waiting. Sobriety, not necessarily stability on an ongoing basis. But anyway, she let me know that my sobriety and my recovery was going to begin the moment that I put forth the effort. And so she spoke to me about writing that 4th step, and I did that. I took my first inventory when I was 30 days sober, and it was by no means a thorough 4th step. I was afraid that if I wrote about my drinking, that the obsession to drink would return. So I just skipped over those years. And you kind of missed the gist of the whole thing, don't you get it? And I wrote about other events in my life, but I'll tell you, it was the first time in my life that I started taking a look at me. I was the kind of person when I was drinking, I was so busy pointing the finger at you and looking at what everybody else did, that I didn't have any time, but I probably didn't have the access to look at myself. And this is the first time I think that I consciously started to really take a look at myself. I took a 304 step when I was 18 months sober. And initially, the reason I knew it was a 304 step was when I was able to sit in an AA meeting and people could talk about the dreaded fourth and fifth step, and my stomach stopped twisting enough. Because prior to having taken those steps, I knew that I was not thorough with that part of the program. So I got a second sponsor during this time, and she gave me some real good information on how to take my fourth step. And she told me that, Hannah, if it's important enough to remember, it's important enough to put on those papers. She suggested that when I start to write, that I write out a prayer and that I ask God to help me to be honest and fearless and thorough. And then I start with my earliest memory and I move forward. She told me that, I wasn't going to write it in one fell swoop, and I didn't. I read it over a period of time. But she told me that anytime I had one of those mental blocks or anything like that just write a little prayer in it. And she said at the end of each session that you write, do not go back and read anything you've written. And that was really good advice for a person like me, because I tended to edit. I really wrote that. I'm not sure that I'm willing to admit that yet, But I didn't do that. I did exactly what she told me to do. And I was kind of, dragging my feet on writing this fourth step. I'd written some, and I'd put it away for a long period of time, and I'd write a little bit more. And what happened is that lady ended up getting drunk. She had 5 years of sobriety, and this terrified me, because I had tucked away in the back of my mind this idea that once somebody stayed sober for a few months or a few years, they were guaranteed a lifetime of sobriety. I thought that you would never drink again if you were able to stay sober for a period of time. And what I realized is the direct result of her experience. I realized why these people keep harping on one day at a time. I realized the tremendous value of today. And I also knew for myself that Alcoholics Anonymous was going to be an all or nothing at all proposition for me. I was going to go all the way to the program of AA, or I wasn't going to get anywhere. And I'm not just talking about attending meetings. I'm talking about working those steps. And it was something that nobody had to point their finger at and tell me about. I knew it. And I got busy writing that fourth step. And the last prayer I put in there was I asked God to put somebody in my life who I could share that fifth step with, because I didn't know anybody to share it with. I put that inventory in the top drawer of my desk, and I went to an AA participation meeting that night, and I shared. And what I shared that night was the terrific fear that I had. And you see, my fear was that I was going to go home from that meeting and I was going to burn that inventory, because I was terrified to share many of the things that I shared with you tonight that were in that inventory. I was terrified to share those with another human being. And what happened was during the meeting, a lady came over to me, and she gave me her name and her phone number. And she said that she would be willing to listen to my fifth step if I wanted her to. Now, I was afraid of this lady because, you see, she had a reputation for being honest. And I had a nodding acquaintance with truth once. And I didn't like it. And I thought, oh my God, of all the people. But, of course, beggars can't be choosers. And I was just itching to get rid of this thing. So I said, yeah, gosh, please. And that was like a Tuesday night. Now, she wanted to wait until Saturday or Sunday, over the weekend. So, I was like on needles and pins all weekend. And, all the rest of the week. So she came over on the weekend, and she picked me up at my house, and I was clutching my manuscript. This thing was like a small novel that I'd written. And she took me to her house and peeled me off the roof of her car and fed me breakfast. I didn't know how she knew I hadn't eaten. My eyes were like big as saucers, and I probably had a pot of coffee already that morning. And so anyway, so she's also a nurse. She was pretty smart. So she fed me, calmed me down, got me in the women's living room, and she had this beanbag chair sitting on the floor. And so I went and sat down and got comfortable, and I handed her my inventory. And of course, she immediately handed it back, and she said, "No, you read it to me." So I read her this inventory. Now, it was late morning when I started to read it to her, and it was dusk before I was through reading. And she only interrupted me once, and that was to say, "Ew." I never tell that part from the podium, but I thought it was a lot more disgusting than that, I have to tell you. So anyway, she just almost had the patience of a saint, to listen to all that for so long. And so anyway, when I was all done, she said, "Okay, you're all done." And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "Okay, I want you to stand up." So I stood up. And my initial impression of having taken the fifth step was not like the weight of the world has just fallen off my back and what a relief. I thought it was the stupidest idea that I ever came up with. And I couldn't believe I had actually gone through this. I felt so uncomfortable. I felt so stripped down. And I think all I could think of is, how can I get out of here, And I was standing there, and I was real nervous, and I was thinking about where to put my arms and how to stand, and just feeling really genuinely vulnerable. And she kind of scumped down this beanbag chair and threw her head back, looked up at me, and she said, "So,
you're a liar, a cheat, a thief, and a whore. I thought, well, kinda. I guess you could say that. And of course, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, is this any way to talk to a newcomer? I mean, is this we care? And actually, what that lady did is she really did me a favor. That she took, 10 seconds to say what I had said over and over again in that inventory. And then she just read between the lines. All the experiences, all the thoughts I had about myself, all the ways I behaved, or just the way that I felt about myself. That's what she said, and I had named that over and over again. And she didn't leave me standing there like that. What she did is she took me through a real simple exercise. And basically what she let me know that day was that as long as I was a sober member of Alcoholics Anonymous, that I was no longer a victim, that was behind me. She said, Hanna, if you want a really good life, it's going to be the way that you live it in Alcoholics Anonymous. If you want a little bit of a good life, put a little bit into AA. But if you want that really good life, you've got to put it all into Alcoholics Anonymous. And I bought her words. And I believe that I put it all into Alcoholics Anonymous. And believe me, I've had many, many times when I think I'm not doing a good enough job and I'm not doing it the right way. But it's good enough because I'm sober. And I've had to walk through all the experiences that you've had to walk through, some of them different, some of them the same. And I've done it sober. And I've done it in Alcoholics Anonymous. And I continue to keep coming back. I've done a lot of service work in Alcoholics Anonymous. I spent 10 years single in AA, and that's another adventure in itself. A couple of people identified. It's real fun when you like alcoholic men. I mean, if you're a woman, and at least I got them sober this time, but you guys are real kick in the pants, I'll tell you. And the value of the program is to drink, one or the other. You find out what your value system is pretty quick. But anyway, I had the time, and I had the encouragement to learn about service in Alcoholics Anonymous. I had the time to go to a lot of conventions, and to go to a lot of meetings, and to go to a lot of different meetings, and really get to experience the lifeblood of Alcoholics Anonymous that I think it's about. You know, when you get down and you get into the different groups, and you wash coffee pots, and you serve on committees, and you speak at meetings, and you just come to the meetings, and you just, all the excitement and exhilaration. It also allowed me to build a very, very strong foundation in Alcoholics Anonymous, and one that I've had to fall back on time and time again. If you're new in AA, or you haven't had a chance to do that yet, by all means do it. It's not all a hard task. It's a really fabulous time. And I've really enjoyed all those things in AA. And on a family event, I can't do it in the same way that I used to do it. When I was 9 years sober, I met the man that I'm married to today, Buzz. And he said he'd give me $5 every time I mentioned his name, Buzz. Buzz. I'll collect later, honey. And I met Buzz at an Orange County Hospital institutional committee meeting. And he invited me out on the panel to be saved. And we fell in love, and the rest is history. Or the rest is present day. And we've lived happily ever after and all those other things. Sober. But anyway, we got a chance to work together on the H&I committee. And I guess that was, I forget when that was, but we were engaged in January, I guess it was 6 years ago this January. And we were married, it'll be 6 years this June 11th. And we had an AA wedding. I had one of those beautiful, beautiful weddings. And I got the opportunity to wear that long white gown that I had so, I dreamed about when I was a little girl. And I had an opportunity to feel as pure and as good as any bride has ever felt on her wedding day. And it was because of AA. It was because of the things, the inside job. The man who married us that day was the man who brought my husband to his very first AA meeting. And the two women who stood for me were members of Alcoholics Anonymous, as was his best man. And we counted between 175 and 200 members of the program who attended our wedding and reception. And it was as pretty a sight of Alcoholics Anonymous as you would ever want to see. It was a dream come true for me. And I told you I felt as proud as I could be. And I think I recognized that every moment of that day that this was because of AA. I had that special day and that special time because of Alcoholics Anonymous. The icing on the cake for me that day was that my mother was there. And if there was ever a way I wanted my mom to see Alcoholics Anonymous, believe me, it was the way that she saw it that day. And I had many, many times prayed for a moment, just one moment with my mom, to show her some little bit of what I've seen in Alcoholics Anonymous. You all know what that's about. I'm sure you've got a family member or a friend somewhere that you just so desperately want to show them AA. And I got my moment with my mom, and it was that day. And I was extremely grateful for that opportunity. We went over to the reception. I got a chance to share with my mom a while. You see, when I was 9 months sober, my mother joined Alcoholics Anonymous on the East Coast. She went to meetings. She went to 2 meetings a week on the East Coast for 1 year, and after a year, she stopped going to meetings. And she was supposedly not drinking all these years, but I did receive a letter a couple of years prior to my wedding from my younger brother who informed me that my mother had returned to drinking. And you see, at the very bottom of this letter, my brother said, "Please don't tell Mom I told you." And you know what I wanted to do? You know, I wanted to call her up and give her all the reasons why she shouldn't be drinking, but I didn't. What I did instead is I called another member of this program. This man gave me probably the most valuable advice I'd ever been given. And what he told me that day on the phone is he said, "Hannah, it takes a lot more love to let go than it does to hang on." And you know, I never knew that. I always thought it was the other way around. I always thought that if you really loved somebody, you'd never let go of them. You know, you just guided them on down that path, and I've had to struggle with that one still. So what happened to me during that time is it became unnecessary for me to say anything to my mom about her drinking. And it put the conditions and a lot of hardship off the relationship. And that's why I say when my mom came to our wedding that day, and it was a surprise. I had no idea my mom was coming to a wedding, but my younger brother was a surprise and he had flown her out there. And when I was making my walk down to get married, I looked up and there stood my mom, and I tell you, it was fabulous. So we got a chance to share at the reception, and there was a lot of people there who'd heard my story before. And I got to introduce my mom to all these people, and it was really fabulous. Exactly 2 weeks after Buzz and I were married, we had just returned home from an AA birthday party, and I had a message to call my older brother, which I did, and my older brother gave me the news that my mother had died. And my mother, too, died of this disease. She committed suicide. It's alcoholism. I don't care what you put on that death certificate. That's what it was. She got into that place where it looked like there was no way out. She got into that utter and hopeless despair, and she thought there was no way out, and that was her answer for her. And I hope it's been a peaceful one for her. It was not a peaceful one for me, I'll tell you that. I was filled with a lot of anger and incredible grief over that experience. You know, telling in all honesty, one of the most difficult things to let go was just not the physical presence of my mother, but it was the dream. I've heard the stories in AA. I've watched the family members get sober, and I had my dream too. And my dream was that one day my mother was going to get sober and that we would share Alcoholics Anonymous together. And that wasn't meant to be. And that was as difficult or more difficult for me to let go of than, as I said, her physical presence. But you know, the reason and the way that I walked through that one with you members of Alcoholics Anonymous, that's the way. I found myself in possession of an absolute miracle 2 days after that I found out my mom had died. I was in a lot of grief and I was in my living room. And what occurred to me is that not one time during that 2-day period, with all the grief and all the feelings that I had going on because of that circumstance, not one time had it occurred to me to drink or to use drugs. And you know what? I was always looking for an answer. And my answer before AA is to drink or to use. And to see what I realized that day was that I had found that answer. And I had found that answer in Alcoholics Anonymous. I found it by living this way of life and by going to AA meetings and being a part of this fellowship and being a part of life. You know what? I can take the bitter with the sweet. And I knew it that day, and I was 10 years sober. And it wasn't anything I had just to talk about. It was something that I knew inside of my very being. And it's something that I've lived with. My husband and I, of course, you know, we had this great idea we were going to start a family. My husband was sure, you know, like, once we had died, well, you know, just 9 months later we'll pop out this little baby. And that didn't happen quite like that quick for us. We ran into some problems, and I had some fertility problems is what it was. And I know there's a lot of people experiencing this today from sharing with them. And I was unable to get pregnant. And I tell you, I felt so ripped off. I felt so angry. You know, I felt like it was unfair. I felt like it was my right to have a family. You know, here we were both sober and really had something I thought to offer a family, and that we couldn't have kids. And it was a really difficult time for me to go through. And I found myself, I go to a women's meeting on a regular basis, and I found myself on Tuesday afternoon at this meeting sharing. And I hadn't shared this with anybody because, you know, I wanted to hold my chin up, and I guess it was that false pride. I found myself finally opening up at this women's meeting and telling them exactly what was going on and spilling out all their feelings. And you know what happened is the women in that group just opened up to me and shared a variety of experience. And I got a lot of strength in that meeting. And it was a real treat for me when a couple of months later I was able to sit in that same meeting and tell those women I was pregnant. And it was a real joke on me when 2 years ago I gave birth not to one baby, but I had a set of twin girls. People go, you got to be careful what you pray for, you know. And they're going to be 2 years old on the 23rd, and I'm going to be 16 years on the 27th. I mean, March is a great year. I mean, March is a great month, and this is a great year. And my kids are here with us, and they're staying over. My godmother lives here in Las Vegas, and they're over with Grandma tonight. And we've had an opportunity to share this program with them, and they're absolutely beautiful. And I'll tell you what, they were very real blessing, especially for what was to come. And what came into our lives just came clear out of the blue. It was a sudden and terribly unexpected change, to say the least. 10 weeks after our babies were born, my husband was hospitalized. And they thought he might have had a ruptured spleen. My husband's a real strong man, you know, and very healthy and very health conscious. And it was a surprise to a lot of us that there was anything physically wrong. And they were going to do surgery the following morning, and I was at my husband's bedside, and the surgeon came in and described what they were going to do, and they told us there was a possibility that it might be cancer. And, I mean, that will shake you to your bones. And when he was through explaining the procedure and everything, we went out of the room, and I went over and I shut the door, and I went by my husband's bedside, and we held hands, and we said that third step prayer. And we have learned what it's like to be united in prayer and to be united in Alcoholics Anonymous in this way of life. And I got up the next morning, and I had people come over the program. You know, my head was just spinning during that time. And I didn't have enough sense to think about it. But people started calling me, and some gals on the program came over and watched my babies while I was able to go out in that waiting room and wait for the results of the surgery. I didn't have enough sense about me to think about calling somebody and asking them to come and wait with me. But when I got into the waiting room, my husband's sponsor and a gal I sponsor were there, and we got to pass the time talking AA. And when the surgeon came out of the operation room, my husband's sponsors were there with me, and the surgeon told me my husband had cancer. And I want to tell you that in that next moment, my whole life came to an absolute standstill. It was like I just went blank. I couldn't believe it. It was like everything that I had, all the ideas, everything that I had built up, that we had built up in our life, stopped. And I mean, to me, it was like a death sentence. I could not believe what he was saying. And, you know, my husband's sponsor had enough sense about him, enough good about him to be able to ask the questions I guess you're supposed to ask during that time. Never been through it, didn't know what to do. He did. And he took over. And I want to tell you that the next few months were filled with incredible terror for me. I was shook to the very roots of my being, to everything that I'd known. What happened to me during that time is that there were people in Alcoholics Anonymous who literally did for me what I could not do for myself. Probably the biggest thing that I got in touch with during that time is that the gratitude that I had that I was not one of those people who, after having an anonymous sobriety, stopped going to meetings. I was so grateful that I had continued to go to meetings. Because the people in AA who came across the room, since they're not the people that were close to us. As a matter of fact, the people who were closest to us were the people that were least able to help us in any way. It was such a shock, and it was so painful to everybody. But there was like this whole underground of cancer patients in AA. And they came out of the woodwork, and they started telling us the stories and the things that they've been through and the variety of things that are available out there. And we've walked through this experience a day at a time, and it's been almost 2 years that we've walked through this. If he has no reoccurrence by the end of this year, they'll consider him cured, and we believe in miracles. But most importantly is I'm not idly sitting back hoping that good things are going to come in my life. I've learned more about living a day at a time than I've ever known in any of my sobriety during this last couple of years. What I want to tell you about what happened to me after that is the fear, the terror that I told you about. I was so afraid. It was so difficult for me to lose my home. I'd had this active life in Alcoholics Anonymous, and there's new little babies and the things going on in our lives. I found myself not able to run to the meetings. I couldn't get pumped up by talking with the people and being with the people all the time. I had to grab at a hold of whatever I had on an inside basis, and it was shaky, and it was a scary time for me. We started looking around, and a lot of the other things that were open to us were some real alternative ways of healing. It became kind of a wee thing. My husband went through the chemotherapy, and you know, that's not a piece of cake, I'll tell you. But we walked through that experience together, and we walked through it with a lot of new people in our life, and they're still in our life today. And it's brought a whole new sense of service and a whole new sense of love into my life. as a result of this experience, and it's not one I've welcomed. I mean, I'm not still, of the mind that I'm really grateful for this kind of experience in my life. Probably the most difficult change I've had to walk through is I was afraid that when I stopped doing all those things in AA that they would forget about me. I was afraid of being invisible again. And it was very difficult. It's hard when you've been a little nerd all your life, and you know what this is like. And you come into AA, and you find yourself suddenly in a position where when I walk into a room, people started looking at me with respect. I start speaking at meetings like this and going around to the conventions. I get a lot of pats on the back, and people tell me what a swell gal I am. And it feels real good. All that recognition feels real good. Then I found myself when people are calling and telling me no, that I can't do that anymore. And it was a real difficult thing for me. I wondered, am I being a good AA member because I'm not doing the things that I used to be? And I had a lot of inner struggles that I had to go through. And yet, I kind of feel like I'm rounding the corner of that experience. And I feel more a solid member of Alcoholics Anonymous than I ever have before. And this is why when Suzanne was sharing about that in the beginning, that I know getting back to those roots and getting back to the values of Alcoholics Anonymous. It's hard to get leveled for some of us. It's hard to have the pride leveled or whatever those sort of things are. But the criticisms, all of the other things have just started to fall away. I'm glad for the opportunity to be able to share with you tonight. I'm glad for the opportunity to assist in any way that I can in terms of service in Alcoholics Anonymous. And I hope you guys have one hell of a good weekend, and thanks for the invitation.